Good day and welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. In this video, I thought we could take a bit of a look at why people are enjoying classic hardcore and the slow, dedicated experience of that gameplay compared to both vanilla and the far faster, yet eerily similar gameplay of WoW Retail. So this video is going to be two parts. In the first part, I'm going to discuss the similarities and the contrasts between WoW Retail and Classic Hardcore. Then I'm going to discuss why Hardcore works as a concept and why it's becoming so popular. So one thing I'd like to get off the bat is that all three versions of the games are distinctly different and provide players with a completely different experience. Retail is a much more streamlined, more interactive, and more not engaging in inverted commas, but more mechanical experience. The combat and the gameplay are fast-paced. The game is incorporated and designed to have a strong end-game repeatability, more so than having a long journey towards that in-game structure. Whereas vanilla, as we all know, is a much slower paced and more methodical process that has simpler baseline mechanics, but has slightly more complex overarching mechanics that engage within its stat systems and RPG mechanics. But what are the similarities between hardcore vanilla or hardcore classic and Retail? Well, the big similarity is that they both are somewhat a solo experience. Hardcore is intrinsically designed to actually separate you from non-hardcore players and almost also separate you from basically group activities. You can only sign up as a duo or a trio, and those duo or trios have to be set at the beginning of your gameplay experience. You can't just randomly join in with other parties or traveling players, which kind of is in contrast to the original design of vanilla World of Warcraft. Now, part of this is due to the fact that there's not really a dedicated hardcore server, so they're trying to create a community within a community, but it is something that will continue onwards. A lot of players wanted even unofficial hardcore servers to be a more minute group experience. And because of this, there's a lack of player interaction. A lot of times people will join dungeons in Classic and you won't have a high level of player interaction or just day-to-day player interaction in general, and the same can be said with Hardcore. Unless you're part of a duo or a trio or you've organized yourself into a guild, you won't get any interaction in the overarching game world, as interaction in the overarching game world could cost you your character's ability to be Hardcore verified. However, in contrast to this, the games are fundamentally different. Hardcore itself has much slower pacing, in fact the slowest pacing of all three variants of the game, whereas Retail obviously has the fastest, and Hardcore continues the philosophical design of vanilla in the journey being more important over the end game. But they both have the same intrinsic flaw. They both essentially take an MMORPG and make it almost a single-player experience. But why is Hardcore Classic making this single-player experience much more manifestable than the Retail one? And this, ultimately at the end of the day, can be surmised up to two things. One, the most important factor, is player immersion or player investment. By having a character that you intrinsically have to delete or remove after a certain number of hours, should you fail or let them die, every decision you make is more considered and more invested than other decisions you would make comparatively on Retail. For example, on Retail, if I run from one side of the map to the other, and my character gets hit by a rare or one-shot or dies or falls into lava or drowns or I accidentally DC, I don't feel any form of concern. Whereas when this happens on Hardcore Classic, there's a high level of concern, more so than vanilla or any other MMO experience. much akin to if you've played Diablo 3 and you've had your character and you're now venturing into the greater rifts, and all of a sudden your character ends up dying. You start to feel a little bit bad because it's hours of your life not wasted but invested into this character. Now, what Diablo 3 does very well is it allows you to transfer the character to a non-hardcore server, very similar to RuneScape's Iron Man principles, how they let you buy secondary lives or transfer characters once you're done with them. The same, hopefully, one day will be apparent for hardcore vanilla, but right now the experience is very cutthroat. You either keep the character alive or you have to get rid of them. But why does hardcore continue to build onto vanilla in a way that WoW retail does not? Again, this is not to say that retail fails in what it's achieving to do. Retail is a holistically different game to what hardcore and vanilla is or have become. However, hardcore builds onto the vanilla experience in a way that retail is different. Retail has been built over the years to manifest a lot of things that have become inconvenient to players. Players have grown up with the game. A lot of them have kids, a lot of them have jobs, a lot of them have less time to play the game of World of Warcraft. And if it's the same player base that was 12 years old when it first came out, they are all now trying to buy houses, having families, and starting their experiences within life. So, retail has adjusted, becoming more alt-friendly, becoming much more fast-paced roller coaster style theme park than it has been in any other way for years. You can consume the story on an intrinsically easy and very well cinematically made level, more so than you could consume the story before. However, in lieu of this, they have also made activities like LFR and lower difficulty levels of dungeons and quests to help accommodate for people with their busy lifestyle. In this way as well, there's always alternative systems to catch up with gear, which means that players have a lot less tied to themselves in terms of gear achievements. Ultimately, at the end of the day, your item level doesn't matter so much, and people more just care about what kind of progress you do within the harder endgame of the game. You're either someone who casually comes on and has a 424 or 430 item level, or you're someone who hardcore plays the game and it has an item level of 441. But the difference between the two players is not very big on a retail server. However, hardcore builds onto vanilla's philosophy of having a more meaningful journey, with the fact that hardcore players can only use gear that they craft or gear that they find from drops, and because of the fact that dungeon runs are limited and they can't trade on the auction house, this means that not only gear is a much more pivotal choice, and every gear piece that you pick up is much more heavily favored or enjoyed by the player, but every talent point, spec, and bit of investment you place in your character is far more considered. On the same token as well, there are rules to prevent you from over-leveling content. You cannot run dungeons when you're much higher level. There are certain bandwidths of levels for which you have to tackle on content, and this keeps the game consistently relevant in terms of difficulty. Players ultimately at the end of the day could sit and farm in the opening area for boars, just like they did in the South Park, but they won't achieve as much because this will take them an excruciatingly long time, and also at the end of the day they'll be behind on gear curve. Now it's important to understand that yes, although hardcore essentially takes the solo experience of retail, yet somehow turns it into a boon for its gameplay comparative to a Contra, there is the notion, at least for me, that all three can exist. Hopefully what they do is they take the vanilla experience and they allow the vanilla experience to continue, maybe moving through Cataclysm or through Pandaria. Hopefully they continue to build on the good decisions they made in Dragonflight with retail, and they continue to build on retail's gameplay to be a more expansive, faster paced or convenient gameplay snapshot of World of Warcraft. And hopefully they take hardcore, and what I hope the most is turn hardcore or hardcore servers or this variation of World of Warcraft into a community-driven project. I think that would be the most impressive change that they could do to World of Warcraft, and it would create a third variant of World of Warcraft, one that could potentially become the greatest version of them all. I think having all three also allows players to really choose or access the one that they are most invested in. Things like hardcore or community-led servers could lead to players, becoming more invested in those servers, whereas vanilla allows players to recapture certain experiences that they've had with the game, and retail, to a certain extent, allows players to continue the journey of Azeroth to its final destination. Whether that's World of Warcraft 2, we won't know. But obviously, talking about the differences between the three variants does lead us to the discussion of why is hardcore succeeding. And we've touched on all of these, but it's very important that we kind of substantiate and very much validate what we are saying when we talk about these certain factors. So the number one factor that I believe is that vanilla succeeds in recreating the RPG moments of the MMORPG. Everything from buying your skills and talents to pieces of armor and the ability for classes to have ammunition, to have certain specs, abilities, pets, and being able to cross-wear gear and kind of slap on anything you find is what makes the game feel more RPG-like. The fact that I can start as a paladin, walk outside, kill a mob, find myself a cloth hood, and put that on because I just need extra armor, makes you feel like you really are someone who's carving their way throughout the world. Hardcore doubles down on this by restricting players' gear choices and making things incredibly important when you decide what to do. You can't get mail from other players, you cannot trade other players, and so even things like choosing whether to do a crafting profession all of a sudden take on far more importance and far more import within a player's experience. It basically means that players have to be far more considerate of the choices they make. The intimate community also adds to this experience. Vanilla was kind of renowned, especially when it was restarted again with the new classic experience, for having a very intimate community. This is because the player base essentially wanted to create a new community, and the mechanics within vanilla experiences allow players to facilitate that community. There's not LFG, there's not any ways to pop into dungeons, and hardcore again doubles down on this principle. Not only can you not just enter dungeons with random players you find or put a server message out, you have to actively link up with other hardcore players, go to the dungeon, be within the dungeon range, and you cannot die in the dungeon. This usually means a much slower, more methodical pacing through the dungeon, which means far more communication, far more interactivity between you and other members, and this translates across all types of content. For example, you will see that there's a lot of posts about the first kind of raid groups hardcore clearing some of the raids in Classic, and it's a very impressive feat because it's taking them a huge amount of investment in time, and everyone knows that time equals value because there's nothing more valuable than time. So the more time you spend on something, the more value you immediately place within it. And this leads us to gravity or weight to all of the decisions. The fact that at any moment you could lose this time to any poor choice, whether that's deciding to run past a rare that you should maybe keep a little bit further away from, or whether that's taking that quest that maybe you really shouldn't, whether it's trying to grab that one item that you think you can, or whether it's making that poor decision to lead the boss the wrong direction in a raid. All of these decisions have much greater gravitas when you consider how much player investment has gone into the characters. And what this does is basically creates a high value generation in the journey. Because all of these things have considerable more weight, because all of these things require you to be far more invested, the value that you gain out of any considerable progress you make within the journey is much more highly valued by you as a player. Every level I gain means that I have a little bit more health or a little bit more stats. It means that I'm less likely to die to these level 3 kobold workers than I was beforehand. And all of this is incredibly important. The fact that every decision I make has intrinsically more value means that me as a player feels every decision gives me more value back. I don't all of a sudden feel like, oh, me choosing this one skill over the other limits my value or lowers my gain of value. Instead, it increases the value I gain from the next decision, because all decisions ultimately lead towards my final destination, which hopefully is max level and hardcore rating. And finally, it's a way of creating a new old experience. Now, a lot is said for nostalgia. Nostalgia drives a lot of our decisions. It's the reason why I always have vanilla ice cream on my waffles and I never try anything else. Because nostalgia dictates that that's the thing I'll enjoy the most. It's also why I haven't changed my pizza flavor for 10 years. Okay, maybe it's OCD for that. But anyway, the point is that nostalgia is a huge driving factor in a lot of our enjoyment of basically anything in our lives. Now, with hardcore, you get the thrill of nostalgia combined with the thrill of something new. And this is a very potent combination. Think of vanilla Coke. It's basically a way to enjoy something incredibly old, but also something that can feel incredibly new. So it provides that comforting blanket of something you're familiar with, whilst also providing you with a sense of thrill in a new experience. You've done all of this before, but never with the weight of possibly dying and losing your character. And this is where classic hardcore truly succeeds the most. It's the combination of this nostalgia factor that players feel and really enjoy compared to the thrill of potentially losing everything in one final swoop. And all of this investment ultimately leads to us finally making our last decision. And that last decision is basically that hardcore classic has just enough balance of the thrill of loss of value and the weight of all decisions, and compared or contrasting that with the nostalgic value of replaying the classic WoW experience. And these two peak at a very high point. Think of it as like taking an experience that's an 8 and combining it with an experience that's a 9.5. Maybe I'll finally have some chocolate sauce on my ice cream on my waffle. These type of decisions basically augment the experience we're having. And by doing so, it essentially makes this new experience a much heightened version of any of the other ones. In fact, just to compare this, I kept one long cut of the classic hardcore gameplay experience instead of doing the multiple smaller cuts that I used for the comparative section in the first part of this video, to see if anyone would notice. And notice, at least from my side, something very important. That even though it was one long cut, every single mob that we killed in the classic portion or the hardcore portion of the video was immediately almost more interesting than the 16 mobs we killed at one time in the first parts of the video. And why is this? This is simply because of two factors. The first being that we as players know that every mob I kill in the hardcore section means a lot more value to my character than any mob I killed in the first part of the video, but also that there's far more threat of me losing value as well. So that kind of explains why hardcore is succeeding. As I mentioned before, I'd like to kind of preface this by saying that all three versions are fantastic games, and I think players shouldn't really try to value or devalue any of them against each other. I think it's fantastic that we have a new way to experience World of Warcraft than what we did before. And I would like to preface this by saying that ultimately at the end of the day, we as players deserve to have different variants of a game like this. In a way, as I mentioned before, if you were to look at Diablo, and Diablo provides multiple gaming experiences. RuneScape, which I think is a great game, OSRS, when I talk about RuneScape, I refer to old school, but RuneScape itself has OSRS, it has Iron Man, it has New RuneScape has its own Iron Man, There's no shame in having multiple variants of the same game. I think each of them will then develop stronger individual communities, and this will aid each game going forward. People who don't want to play Classic don't need to play Classic now to get their fix of World of Warcraft. And the same can be said for those people that maybe want the experience of retail, but just don't feel like handling the vanilla kind of experience. I think being able to separate these communities will be better suited towards the long-term health of all three games. Of course, there can be said things for splitting the player base into three separate parts, but I think ultimately at the end of the day, the player base in World of Warcraft is big enough to handle this kind of split. But that's going to be it from me. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. I'd love to hear basically your own opinions on Hardcore Classic. And until then, I'd love to see you guys in the next video. But that's it from me, and I'll see you guys next time. Till then, take care, and bye.